In this episode, I have the Mooch back in the nerd zone. We're going to talk about what the hell happened in November, the financial markets, the state of the White House, the future of the Republican Party, and of course, what the heck is Andrew M.F. Yang going to do next? But first...
There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
The Mooch is back in the nerd zone. Anthony, last time you were here was in April. How have you been, man? How have you and your family been?
Well, I mean, the good news is, we've been very quarantined. Maybe that's the most nerditacious thing to do, but I haven't gotten COVID, thank God. The kids haven't, thank God. But we all of us know that it's somewhat of a luck of the draw because you have to move around a little bit. And so, unfortunately, a couple of my close friends have gotten it. Thank God we weren't in contact with them, but they seem to be doing okay. And obviously younger people seem to be okay, although there are some that obviously get hit very hard. So it's one of these things where, the goal is not to get it and to wait patiently for the vaccine. I'm a big, whatever the right word is, Tom, I'm a pro-vaxxer. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I can explain that scientifically, and most nerds know what I'm talking about. They do their research. And so I will get the vaccine when it's available to me, not a day earlier, but certainly not a day later either. I would like to get it.
Yeah, it's certainly, if you run the numbers, it's probably in everybody's interest to get vaccinated so that we can have less risk and we can also get back to a sense of normalcy. I wonder, the president has been talking a lot about the what he calls the Trump vaccine. And I'm curious to get your thoughts because it's an interesting kind of combination of strategies that he seems to have. On the one hand, he originally downplayed it, really tried to focus attention on China, talked about liberating Michigan, liberating Wisconsin, about, freedom and not to be afraid. And now he's saying, hey, look, I'm the one that got this vaccine. And to me, I struggle with the way he's acting today because we don't have the vaccine. Like I don't have access to the vaccine. You won't. Most of us won't for maybe 6 months. So why not emphasize mitigation?
I'm a lot older than you, Tom. So in my age group, it looks like I'm getting the vaccine mid-March. So
yeah, okay, you might get a little priority treatment.
I just want everybody to know that I want to stipulate is I'm aging like a Japanese woman. So I think I look fantastic for 105 years old.
Yeah,
but what you're saying, is really why he lost. And so ultimately, when you reflect back on the Trump presidency, the Trump personality, it was a lack of executive management function. And it was a lack of managerial process. And you can't take that job without having a process. And so whether Richard Neustadt, the professor from the 60s that wrote about the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administrations, Fred Greenstein, the Princeton professor, who wrote about these processes too. There's a White House model of management or a cabinet model of management. But what the president effectively did was he had a billiard table model of management where he shot a cue ball into his people. They were blown to pieces on the billiard table. People didn't know what to do, how to act. Moreover, they didn't want to be humiliated by him by tweet. They didn't want to be fired by him or ridiculed by him to a Super Bowl audience ×2. And so a result of which he paralyzed the executive branch. And everything that he did, if you knew him well, was predictable based on him. H.R. McMaster said in his book Battlegrounds that the president was a reflexive intuitive, which is Pentagon speak for he'll do the opposite of what you tell him to do because he's emotionally insecure. He's intellectually insecure. And so if he's got an expert in front of him and tells him to do A, B, and C, he'll do X, Y, Z to prove to the expert that he's smarter than the expert. And that was unfortunate for the United States, the American people, and for the global economy, because there's an unnecessary several 100,000 people dead that didn't have to be dead as a result of his poor management.
Yeah. I mean, if you, I have a brother who is now in Singapore, and he was showing me pictures of like, oh, the stores are open, like things are moving, people are going to work. And I was like, oh, but you don't have the vaccine yet. And he's like, yeah, but what we do is when people come into the country, there's like mandatory, like serious mandatory quarantining. There's temperature checks all over the place. There's lots and lots of testing. And it seems like there was this nuanced view, which is like, you can be very vigilant and take precautions and support the economy. It isn't a shut it completely down or, you know, live free and prosper kind of binary choice. And that's a nuance that I feel like it's not that complicated to kind of understand a continuum, but it seems like that's not part of the Trump kind of leadership style. It's very much like good versus evil, like right versus wrong. There is no kind of like five-pronged approach for him.
Well, also, you know, there's a control issue there, right? And so, you know, some would say Fareed Zakaria in his recent book that the West, due to its individual liberties, may not be designed for the necessary coordination and the group subordination of the individual to the group to protect everybody. And so that's one thing. But the other thing is you have to deal with the reality of life. And what good leadership requires is somebody explaining to the American people what it is that they would need to do to protect themselves and to protect their families. And the weird thing about it, Tom, and you know this, it's a short period of time. You're mentioning Singapore, or look at what's going on in South Korea. The cases have elevated slightly, but in South Korea, they have 20 deaths per million citizens. We have 630 deaths per million citizens, and ours is obviously going up. You just have to think about the catastrophe of that. We are 30 times worse than South Korea. And so good leadership would have required people to say, listen, I'm all for individual liberty. I'm all for the Western model of liberal democracy and people to express their individual freedom. But this is about harm. And this is about if we're going to harm each other right now with a great virus that is spreading and a global pandemic that we haven't seen for 100 plus years. And again, a coordination with those states, a coordination with the governors of those states would have really helped. And listen, I want to be fair to the president. Operation Warp Speed was a very smart thing. It pushed out capital into biomedical laboratories and gave them a downside risk protection that they needed to do this sort of a moonshot sort of thing. And what they developed, these gene therapies and this programming your body to protect yourself as opposed to infecting you with a weakened disease, I think is a brilliant thing. And it's a blueprint for the future, and it'll probably protect citizens from future pandemics like the one we're experiencing right now. So all of those things I want to give the president and his team credit for. But then you have this duality going where at the same time that they're doing that, he's ripping his mask off his face like the American Mussolini. He's encouraging people to, I guess, super spread. You had more people infected at the White House than you had in the entire country of New Zealand. So this is a nerd podcast. I mean, come on, guys. I mean, we're smarter than this. I mean, come on. You don't have to be a nerd to understand what we're doing is putting everybody in harm's way, delaying the economic recovery, delaying people's ability to do well. I was with one of my relatives, one of my cousins, is a blue collar guy. He's an always Trumper. No matter what my fight was with President Trump, he's an always Trumper, wears the reddest of red hats. He turned to me at a small lunch, and he said, well, what the hell difference does it make? If I want to get sick and I want to get my family sick and do whatever I want to do, it's my life, it's my choice. I said, well, that's one way to look at it, but you're harming people. And also, how many hospital beds do we have in the country? You have 344 million people, if you count all the immigrants, the undocumented, the documented, all of the people that are here. You have 343 million people living in the 50 states, and you have 1 million hospital beds. Of those 1 million hospital beds, you have 300,000 that are ICUs. And so my point to my relative is, you could get sick, but you could get very sick. You could end up in an ICU bed. We don't have the capacity in the country to handle the nonsense that people were talking about. Your podcast is known as Nerds for Humanity. The herd immunity strategy should be known as herds for inhumanity. It's just a nonsensical thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the charts of hospitalizations, not only is the U.S. #1 in COVID hospitalizations, but I think people forget that there are other people who are now deferring their health care and aren't able to receive as much hospital attention because all these COVID patients are basically pouring in. And so I agree with you. Hey, if someone lived on a ranch and they wanted to sign a waiver saying like, look, if I need emergency care, if I need COVID care, I'm good. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm not going to go to the hospital, and I'm not going to go to the community areas and go to the supermarket and kind of like, spread my air around. Then, hey, it's a free country. You do it's your body, whatever. You're 18 and over, do what you want. But the moment you say, no, I'm going to make these choices. I'm going to put myself at risk, but I'm also then going to mix with the rest of the community. And then I'm going to expect the infrastructure to bail me out, even if I make these choices. I mean, the irony is that the Republican Party used to be the party of individual responsibility and really thinking about sort of doing the right thing and taking care of yourself. But you can't have it both ways. You can't like drive drunk and then expect everybody to kind of save you if you kind of repeatedly do it. At some point, you lose your license, right? And so I do struggle with that myself, because I think what makes this country amazing is the creativity and the freedom and the individual liberties we have. But when you have a global pandemic, you do wonder like, wow, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, like Japan, sometimes a team first effort does pay off. And I just wonder, like, how do we not only get through that, but now we have a new challenge, which is, as you've probably been reading about, all these like Russian cyber attacks. And it seems to have a similar pattern in that it is being misinterpreted by some, in my opinion, as an attack on the president, which it might be, but it really is also a legitimate attack on the country. And if we just dismiss it as, oh, no, those are just never Trumpers making noise, Russia, 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 then we may just ignore it or kind of have a ham-fisted kind of response. Do you think, what are your thoughts on the national security stuff with all these hacking and kind of foreign efforts?
Well, listen, I mean, I'm not surprised by it, and, I'm not equivocating. We hack people, they hack us. It is part of the future of warfare. This part of disambiguation as it relates to our competitors and our adversaries. So I'm not surprised by it, but I guess what I'm surprised by is our response to it. I mean, at some point, we would have to ask ourselves, this is the American president. He will trash Western leaders. He'll trash fellow Americans. He went after my suburban housewife, Deirdre. He knew that her and I were fighting with each other while I was working for him. So he'll go after private citizens, suburban housewives, his fellow Republicans. He'll go after Western leaders, but he will not go after, under any circumstances, President Vladimir Putin, under any circumstances. And so when Mitt Romney is telling you that this was the equivalent of a Pearl Harbor attack on our systems in terms of what took place and in terms of how flat-footed we were in our response to what they were doing. And the American president is not saying anything. I thank God every day that he was defeated by the American people and he's going to be replaced by somebody that is a patriot. Whatever my policy differences may be with Joe Biden, and I'm not saying that there are many, but thank God he's not Donald Trump. And so we have to move forward and we have to be vigilant and we have to repair the country. And there's something that's going on right now that we have to fix, and that's our national purpose. For whatever reason, we seem like, and maybe some of it is the pandemic and maybe some of it is the Trump era, but we're sort of drawing ourselves inward to ourselves and with some level of selfishness. And I think we have to go back to what really did make the country great, which was this national purpose, this national commitment, this conjoinment. Tom, in the final days, written by Woodward and Bernstein, they interviewed some of the Republican senators that broke with President Nixon and sort of forced him to resign. And one of them was in the Second World War. And he said, well, I had my choice to be partisan, or I could remember my friend whose head was blown off by a German sniper while I was standing next to him, talking to him. He was my friend. We were standing there. The bullet whizzed by me. It hit my friend and splattered his head, and he died. And for some reason, God allowed me to live, and I'm now a U.S. senator. That man that was my best friend died for this document, died for our freedom, died for this Constitution. So should I be subservient to this man and partisan politics, or should I be patriotic and think about the document and the higher order of principles of my patriotism? And so he went with the latter, and he basically said to Richard Nixon, you got to go. And so we're not doing that anymore. We've got congressmen and senators that have physical courage. They fought in the war, whether it's Tom Cotton or Representative Crenshaw, but they have no moral courage. They're standing alongside of this guy who is obviously a criminal, and they're standing alongside of the guy who is un-American because they think it's better for them from a power politics point of view. And so, it's distressful to me. I don't like it, but I'm proud to speak out about it, and I'm proud to hang with people like you and Andrew Yang and others that love the country and want to see if we can hit a reset and bring national purpose back into the fold. Not to say that we're not going to have our individual liberty, but we need to have a national purpose and an agenda to fix our infrastructure and to retrain our middle and lower middle class workers, and obviously a K through 12 educational system at the public level that doesn't discriminate the way it does right now as it relates to zip code. If you tell me the zip code of the kid, I can tell you whether or not that kid can get a good public school education. And there's a level of unfairness to that, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the president's reluctance to criticize Putin, at least publicly. Well, if in an alternate scenario, if our intelligence services had similar kind of credible consensus that it was not Russia, but it was China or Iran, do you think the president would be reacting differently, or do you think, he's just kind of the same regardless of the foreign policy stuff?
Well, he's going to be the contrarian. He's definitely going to be the person that pushes back on the intelligence agencies, and he's going to be this sort of ridiculous conspiracy theorist contrarian. But no, he would be rougher on Iran. He would be perhaps some racial undertones to that. He would definitely be rougher on China, but he's not rough on Vladimir Putin. And so you'd have to ask yourself rhetorically why. And there's a very large group of people in the intelligence community that think that there's something going on there. He's either a useful idiot, or he's a rube, or something worse than that he's on the take somewhere. And it'll come out. And I think one of the reasons why he's recoiling and he's trying to figure out if he could literally create a coup attempt to stay in power is that a lot of this stuff is going to come out. There'll be investigations related to his campaign financing and where that money went. There'll be investigations related to the Emoluments Act and the monies that have come into him and his hotels and his family members from foreign enterprises, which is directly against everything that we think of in terms of our public servants and what they should be doing. And so he knows that money is going to be traced, and he knows that he's got criminal investigations going on at the same time. And so he's manifesting this behavior that's absurd. Now, the good news is the American institutions, the democracy, and the majority of the people know what's up, and they forced him out of office by repudiating him. But the bad news is you've got 75 million people that feel left out of this system. They feel angry about what's going on in the country. And he's a representative of theirs. He's an avatar of their anger. We can't knock those people, Tom. We have to figure out what's up with those people, and we have to figure out how to reach those people and to heal those people so that we can combine ourselves again and think about America and think of ourselves as Americans first, as opposed to these identity tropes that we're now using against each other.
Let's talk a little bit about that first week of November. It feels like a long time ago, but it's really just a little over a month ago. I'm curious how it unfolded in front of your eyes, because I guess I was a little naive. I expected that Trump would lose and that he would make all kinds of accusations for the first few days, but then eventually he would maybe grudgingly concede and still be a strong advocate for his political beliefs and everything. But there would be a normal transition and we would move on. Obviously, that hasn't happened. What was your how were you kind of taking it all in, and how would you evaluate just this last month in terms of presidential transitions and what the White House is doing these days?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things I want to say. I mean, the first thing is that they did everything they could to stop the tabulation of absentee votes and mail-in votes prior to Election Day. And so, as an example, the Republican-controlled Senate in the state of Pennsylvania, they changed the rules. They said, okay, you can only start tabulating these mail-in ballots the day of the election. And so, of course, that would take 4 or 5 days, or ended up being Saturday of the following week to get the votes tabulated. And so why did they do that? They knew it was going to be a very close election, and the president thought he could flip things and turn the card table over by saying that he won on election night, but he lost through gimmickry and he lost through fraud. And so it didn't work because guys like Chris Krebs, American Patriots, who was at the Department of Homeland Security in charge of the security around these elections, were forceful and explained to people exactly what happened. You had Raffensperger, a Republican that voted for Trump, the Secretary of State of Georgia, abiding to the Constitution and proving to people that no, there was no fraud, and that if we're going to abide by a democratic process, he lost the vote. He lost at the Electoral College level. He lost at the popular level, and he lost. He got his ass handed to him. He 5 states flipped on him, and he lost by 7 million votes. And so that's a pretty big, thumping, if you will. And then secondarily, I would have thought that he would have conceded much the same as you did because of these investigations. So Tony Schwartz got it right. In October of 2015, he said if he wins the presidency, he'll never leave, or he'll try not to leave. He's not going to be a guy that if he loses re-election, he'll say forever that it was fraudulent, that he won't concede, and he would manifesting all the things that he's doing now. This is completely against his self-interest, because if you're Joe Biden now, or you're members of the people that want to ensure the institutions of our democracy, you got to go hard at this guy now, because this guy is an absolute systemic threat to the American democracy. And if he's done something wrong, he's got to be jailed. And so, they'll say, oh, well, we can't jail a former president and so on and so forth. Okay, fine. But let's get him to at least admit to the felonies that he's perpetrated, because once he's done that, he can't run again. This is a systemic danger to the country. And What I don't like about what's going on right now is that you've got little acolytes of his that are trying to act more Trumpy than him. And so they think that that's their ticket. They see this 74 million voters and they see those congressional seats flipping as a sign, okay, we just need to be more Trumpy than Trump. And I think that that is very, very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of Obama's book, Promised Land. And it's interesting. He's talking about the transition when he won the first time and how the George W. Bush team was working with his team on troop levels in Iraq and Afghanistan, like before he was sworn in, basically saying, look, we get it. You're going to be coming in. So we don't want to make any calls that box you in. So we want to kind of start collaborating now and get your input, and we can kind of hold things off. And then once you're sworn in, you can take the ball. They also say that I've also read that when Bush took over, because of the Gore kind of Supreme Court Florida kind of delay, that kind of less effective transition or compressed transition resulted in less information transparency between the administrations, and maybe 9/11 we could have gotten a little bit more in front of it. Do you feel like, because of it sounds like there's not as much transition activity going on now between the Trump administration and the Biden kind of elect team, do you feel like there's actually other risks in this kind of like messy handover that we're going to now kind of reap 6 months from now or a year from now? Or do you think, like, look, the government's pretty effective at maintaining its inertia?
Well, I would say this: the 9/11 Commission basically said that we were put 6 weeks behind in terms of national security preparation for the new administration, and they do directly blame that as being one of the reasons why we missed some of the intelligence cues that were going on related to bin Laden and Al Qaeda. I would also point out that in the president's book, President Obama, not that I may be slightly ahead of you in reading, I mean, maybe a chapter or two ahead of you, but I think it's worth pointing out to our fellow nerds here that Obama does compliment the Bush administration in that book. President Obama, he basically says that they were offering him a freebie, meaning, well, if you want XYZ troop levels versus EYX troop levels, we'll do it for you so you don't have to take the heat. Imagine that going on with President Trump. And the direct answer to your question is yes, we are made more vulnerable by Mr. Trump. For some reason, he almost has Putin's checklist. What are Putin's checklists? Disrupt the American democracy, make Americans feel that their democracy and the vote and so forth can't be trusted. Check. Weaken the United States globally. Certainly call into question NATO. And put pressure on the American alliances. Check. Destroy the American economy. Mishandle the pandemic to the point where your economic record, Mr. Trump's economic record, President Trump's economic record is horrific, despite all the nonsense that he says about it. It was he was running below the Obama GDP numbers for the 4 years prior to the pandemic, and he racked up $7 trillion of deficit spending. So he's not a conservative Republican by any means doing stuff like that. So everything that Mr. Putin would have wanted, he got out of Mr. Trump. And now this last gasp here, leave the next administration hobbled with your stupidity. And then you have this notion that Republicans want to rescind the $450 billion that's available to be used by the Federal Reserve for more disaster relief associated with COVID-19. They want to do away with that to force the hand of the new Biden administration. I mean, this is, I don't know. I mean, this to me, it sounds like Putin's playbook, frankly, and it sounds like they've gotten everything they've wanted. So one of my rhetorical questions is, I wonder how much Mr. Trump actually got paid to do all of this, because it's nonsensical what's going on, and it's classically un-American.
Yeah, it's funny. My mom is a hardcore Republican. She immigrated here in the early 70s from escaping Red China. So she's definitely pro-freedom. But interestingly enough, she has now been quite reluctant to criticize Russia as well, which is interesting because when I grew up in the 80s, the Soviet Union, there was no ifs, ands, or buts. You know, it was like, those are the bad guys. And now we have, you know, the former head of the KGB running Russia, and we are half of the country, it seems very open to kind of saying, well, no, there's nothing there. It must be China. It's always China. It's never Russia. I'm wondering, let's talk about the future of the Republican Party. You know, for many decades, I was a registered Republican. I'm no longer. But it did stand for a lot of things that I still believe are important, like individual liberties, fiscal responsibility. Yeah. I remember when the Republican Party was for many the party of the nerds, where there were people that are deep into economics and policy and balancing budgets, like really interesting entitlement reform, things that I get super excited about. I don't see that in the Republican Party today. And I even see Trump supporters calling Romney, the former nominee of the Republican Party, a Republican in name only. They probably say similar things about you. I mean, it's like, who's really the Republicans now?
Well, you know, Governor Romney actually said today that he's representing a much more narrow sleeve of the Republican Party, and the party's now been hijacked by Trumpism, and Trumpism is sort of this distortion. It's a white nationalism. It's got racial undertones to it. You know, but I want to go back to the Russia thing for a second. I don't have anything against Russians. I don't have anything against the notion of Russia, and I understand Russian history and have read a lot of Russian literature, and because of where they are in the middle of Europe and Asia, they're sitting in between these two cultures and two worlds, if you will. They've always felt left out of the game, and there's a lot of pride there for the Russian people and frankly for the Russian government. And I certainly recognize that they're adversarial to us because don't read them anymore, but I've read the intelligence briefings. I have a very good understanding of what our adversaries are doing to us. I think it's important to explain it to the American people so that we can get their support at the government level to reject what our adversaries are doing and to push back on them. But where our adversaries are not adversarial and we're conjoined, we should work with them. And, you know, when you mentioned China, I want us to have a very strong bilateral relationship with China. Am I in love with everything that the Communist Party of China, the Chinese Communist Party, does? Of course not. I'm not. But I'm also recognizing through pragmatism and practicality that we need to have a strong bilateral relationship with them. And if we're going to try to enforce or force internal reforms, I would say the same thing. Imagine an external power to the United States trying to do that to us, and think about how resistant we would be as well. So we have to manage these things carefully, and we have to manage these things with a level of realism. But I'm not looking for adversarial conflict with people. I'm just looking for, here's the cards on the table. Here's what people are doing to us. Here's how we need to countermand them. And if we want to promote peace and prosperity, which has really been part of the American agenda since the end of the Second World War, not that we're perfect and not that we haven't made mistakes in the Middle East or Vietnam or elsewhere, but that's been the goal, and it's been a winning goal. If you look at the last 80 years, there's been great peace and great prosperity around the world. We helped to onboard China into the World Trade Organization. The Russians have some legitimacy in claiming that we weren't going to overreach into Eastern Europe with NATO, and they feel that we did that. But the flip side is they shouldn't be in the Ukraine invading that sovereign country. So this stuff, Tom, is very, very complicated. I'm not sitting here with a black and white altimeter, and I'm not a righteous guy making judgments as much as I am someone that's very practical. But here's what I will say is that if we don't make ourselves stronger from within, if we don't rebuild our infrastructure, if we don't give our middle and lower middle class people aspirational opportunity. Again, I grew up in a blue collar family, and so I was able to get that. And I grew up, I'm older than you, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s, not the 80s. I was already in college and law school in the 80s, but I'm just saying, listen, if we can do that for people and we can make ourselves stronger internally and we can be more cohesive and we can have less partisan rancor and more bipartisan unity on big and bold ideas, it's going to be better for us. It's going to be better for the world. And so Donald Trump didn't represent that. Donald Trump had the opportunity to do that. He could have been a transformative leader. When I went to go work for him, I was thinking, okay, this guy's 70 years old. He's lived a pretty interesting life. Why does he need to be this rancorous politician? Why doesn't he try to break the fever in America and do something transformative? And he didn't do that. And now I'm hoping and praying that Vice President, now President-elect Biden, will.
Yeah, it's I do hope that we find national purpose and unity again. One of our audience members and a member of this channel, Soldier One, is asking, well, how do we reach this, call it 80 million people who supported Trump?
Yeah.
Because they're not going away. Trump might be going away, but these folks, you have to assume majority have positive intent, and they're angry and they're frustrated and they were not happy with the choice they were given. Like, how do we move forward? How do we find a win-win here?
Well, it's interesting that the person is using 80 million because 74 million people voted. But if you look at the people that didn't vote that would be supporters of Trump, it's actually more than 80 million. In other words, doing a statistical extrapolation of what people were thinking on election day, he probably had 85 to 90 million people, Tom, that were supporting him in the country. And so what I don't like happening is people calling them deplorable and people sickened by them, and so every one of them is a racist because they see Donald Trump as a racist. I think that is a recipe for unmitigated disaster for the country. I would stipulate three things in to answer that question. Number one, typically people who are that angry, they don't stay angry forever unless they are further incited. And Mr. Trump is very, very good at that. But if they are angry, we have to address the basis of their anger. To me, my observation of those people is that it's two parts. It's one part tribal and identity politics, and it's stoking the fears, racism and xenophobia. And so we have to, good leadership, good political leadership requires us to work on defeasing those things. And I have typically found that the best way to do that is bringing people together. Because when you grew up in a parochial environment like I did, and we were not lower, we were middle class. I don't want to dishonor my dad by saying that. He worked super hard for his hourly wage, but we never traveled anywhere. I mean, I didn't get out of my hometown until I got to college. And then once I got to college, I was able to start traveling and meeting people from different walks of life, different faiths. You have this dawning, oh my God, we're all the same. We're really not that much different than each other. And so we need to reduce that xenophobia and reduce that tribalism by creating more togetherness and forcing people out of their comfort zones. But the secondary thing is an economic one. And that is, as I've said, I grew up in an aspirational working class family. Those people 35 short years later feel desperational. And so we have to figure out a way to heal that. I have said that to people in the Biden economic team. Come up with the right policies where people feel like they have more in their pocketbook and they have more hope for their children. And guess what happens? They become less angry. They become more focused on the greater good as opposed to throwing Molotov cocktails at the society. And then the last thing is you need strong leadership to repudiate Trumpism. And we have to do that. We have to explain that that is a hate-based rhetoric. That is divisive rhetoric. It shouldn't be tolerated in a pluralistic society like ours. But we have too many leaders in our country right now that are thermometers as opposed to thermostats. And just quickly on that, thermometer senses the temperature and then goes with that temperature, reflects it back to the population. But a thermostat is like, okay, wow, it's hot in here. It's 90 degrees. We got to get this thing down to 72 degrees. And a thermostat on your furnace at home or your air conditioning, you press the coordinates and you reduce the temperature. That requires a lot more courage. It requires a lot more boldness of thinking. and it's a lot higher risk. Just I want you to imagine in August of 2019, I'm a traditional lifelong Republican, fired from the White House in July of 2017, tried to stay loyal to the president and the president's agenda. But after 2 years of doing that, recognizing the guy's nuts, can't support this anymore. And at the height of his poll numbers, repudiating him and then working towards trying to see him defeated. Death threats I've gotten. It's been harmful to my business. It's been harmful to some of my family members, but it's required. And the point is, to the gentleman or the gentlewoman that's asking that question, those are the three things: break down the tribal politics, provide hope and opportunity economically to people, and have a bold, fresh leadership that is willing to have a backbone in the face of all of this, to stand up for right versus wrong.
I love it. I know we're running short on time, Anthony. I just have two more quick topics, if you're okay with it.
Okay. Yeah, no, please. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, well, since we've got the Skybridge guy here, we should talk about the markets, the financial markets, because they seem to be doing quite well. And I'm curious how to interpret what investors are thinking. The president had predicted a major market crash and evaporation of our 401ks the moment if Biden won. It seems like the markets are okay with a Biden presidency, or the premise of that. What's getting investors so enthusiastic? Because you look at the charts, you wouldn't know there's a global pandemic right now.
Well, I think there's a relief rally that Biden won, because I think the lack of predictability of President Trump was exhausting to the markets. I think the markets had Trump fatigue, but I think you're asking a broader question. You have an unbelievable amount of liquidity, $4 trillion promised by the Federal Reserve, a spigot of liquidity that we've never seen before, a 25% increase in the monetary supply of the United States in 6 months. And so when you're doing that, Tom, and you have zero interest rates, or the 10-year interest rate, say, is 90 basis points. So that means you're getting 9 basis points a year, or some nonsense like that, or 9 basis points a month, I should say, per year. I mean, it's ridiculous. And so when you stop and you look at that, where's the money going to go? It's going to go into high growth names. It's going to go into the foam and the technology. It's going to go into the market. It's obviously finding its way to Bitcoin, because people have decided that Bitcoin is a store of value, and there's a finite number of coins, 21 million of them, and a result of which people feel, well, okay, that is almost like a collectible, and it's comparable now to gold. And so that's why you're seeing such a run in Bitcoin. All of that's directly related to Federal Reserve monetary policy. And so what I said prior to the election is that the Fed's not changing. If anything, now with the introduction of Janet Yellen as Secretary of Treasury, I think you're going to have even more dovishness, and that's being reflected in share prices right now. And I think the last point is, if we get the pandemic under control, if the vaccines work and we start to develop herd immunity and we can pull ourselves out of this thing, and let's say that happens in 3 to 6 months or 9 months, you'll have an explosion of pent-up consumerism, which I think the market is anticipating, which is why we're willing to accept 23 times 2021 earnings, because we see in 2022 very robust recovery. And so, yes, I'm bullish on the markets. I think there's no reason to pull back right here. That's not to say that we won't have a market top and a correction. We always do. But the economy is going to pick up. And I'll remind people, after we got out of the last pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, we had the introduction of these new technologies, the communications, wired communications. We were electrifying rural areas of the United States. We were building bridges, roads, and tunnels for this horseless carriage that Henry Ford was mass producing. And lo and behold, we had this economic boom that became the Roaring '20s. Well, you have the same sort of thing going on right now. You have the introduction of all this immunotherapy. You have 5G technology, which is going to be transformative, AI, which is going to be transformative, the move to solar power and carbon-free energy, which is going to be transformative. All of these things are going to be hitting the world over the next 3 to 5 years. And so for those reasons as well, you should be very optimistic. I think the big thing we have to all figure out as a society, as the American society, is how we're going to steepen and widen the amount of wealth in the country, and so that it just doesn't stick to the top. And I'm not a socialist by any means. I believe in unequal outcomes, and I believe that people should rise to their levels of innovation and their industry and their entrepreneurship. But the flip side is we need to create a platform in the country of equal opportunity, because none of us pick our parents. You didn't pick your parents. I didn't pick mine. You and I have been blessed. But there are people that perhaps are born into certain situations through no fault of their own that we should figure out, because of our abundance and wealth, a platform of equal opportunity for them to excel in our society. And so if we can do those things, I'm very, very optimistic about the future. But we need to defeat anti-democratic forces in America, and we need to defeat the specter of white nationalism and the populism that comes from that, because it's very unhealthy and it always leads to a tragic outcome.
Mooch, let's talk about Andrew Yang, because some of the things you mentioned, this all of these new technologies and innovations ahead of us, also probably will represent a great shift in labor markets and demand for different types of skills.
Yeah.
And, you know, look, I live in the Bay Area, you live in the New York City metropolitan area. There's going to be great opportunity for folks like us. Then there's a lot of people who are not going to participate in the 5G revolution, in AI, in whatever, space, electrification, all this, you know, renewables, all that kind of stuff. And Yang had always argued that because of these disruptions, we do need sort of an economic floor that would be funded by a VAT, so that people can kind of transition, because you can't tell the truck driver who's going to be replaced by a self-driving truck, like, oh, well, go get a job at Facebook. Like that's going to be very unlikely. And I'm curious now that, you know, we're since we last talked in April, you seem kind of interested in Andrew, and I know you were on his Yang Speaks podcast subsequently, and you've been probably observing him. What's your take on this guy? Like, what's your read?
Well, you know, as I said to you in April, I'm a huge fan of Andrew Yang's, and again, to be totally candid, when he started talking about universal base income, I was like, okay, this guy's a communist, this guy's a socialist, and that was my reaction. And that was a very superficial reaction. And then once I did a deeper dive into what he was saying and why he was saying it, weirdly, Andrew Yang's ideas are the most libertarian, they're the most individualistic ideas. If anything, they're anti-communistic, they're anti-socialistic. And if anything, what Andrew's proposing is an opportunity really to reset the society and actually make the society fairer, but also provide what we're both talking about, this individual platform of opportunity where, regardless of where you're from or what your family's from, if you have this sort of platform that you can rise from, and you can get the opportunity to get well educated and all these other things, all of a sudden you have this much fairer society. And then weirdly, people can individually express themselves even with more individualism and more innovation and creativity if they have that de-risking happen to them at the bottom end. And so for those reasons, I think he's a brilliant guy. I think he's a visionary. He's won me over, and I think it's my job and your job, frankly, Tom, and others, to win more and more people over to the ideas that Andrew is espousing. And here's what I would say. He deserves a cabinet position in the Biden administration, but my sense is he's not going to get one, not because he's not deserving of one or not because they don't want to give him one, but I think he may have political ambitions to run for mayor of New York City. And I don't know that for a fact. I haven't talked to Andrew directly. But if that is the case, he is somebody that I would support. I think he is a guy that sees the future and sees the potential that the country has for the future. And I'm partial to New York. You have to forgive me. I know you live in the Bay Area, but I'm a lifelong New Yorker. Yes, I live on Long Island, but I work in New York City. My office has been there for 32 years. And I want to see New York City flourish and create a renaissance there. Andrew's the type of guy that could do that. And so, yeah, no, I have Andrew's got a very bright future. He's a very deep and broad thinker, and I'm super impressed with him. And I want to help him if I can, if that's a direction that he wants to go in.
Right on. So Anthony Scaramucci is sounds like an endorsement of Yang if he runs for mayor. You would
listen. I will help him if he's the guy. If he sticks his neck out to run for mayor and he wants my help, I'll be there for him.
What do you think? Like, if you were just a buddy of his, is that the smart call? There's been a lot of debate within the Yang Gang as to is this really the job you want, kind of thing. Like, if he wins it. It's not exactly like being dealt, pocket kings to be the mayor of New York right now. Like it's got issues. What do you think?
I mean, look, none of these jobs are going to be a walk in the park right now. Whether you're governor of New York, mayor of New York, governor of any of the 50 states, mayor of any of the big countries. The big cities. Mm-hmm. None of these are going to be a walk in the park right now. Look at the Biden administration and the challenges that the Biden administration is going to have. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you something about Andrew's personality, which I really admire. He's got a low temperature. He's not a guy that needs to be into the smash mouth talking. He's not a shock jock. President Trump was the first shock jock president. And I think Andrew's the type of guy that I think could provide a lot of healing. And so you're asking a big meta question. Is that a big enough job for him, or is that the right job for him? I don't know the answer to that. But here's what I know is that he's a capable guy. He's a great decision maker. And if he wants to do that job, I want to be there for him. I want to help him. And someone just said, yay for the Scaramucci endorsement. I am endorsing him. But the flip side is, I don't know if he's doing it or not. But if he is doing it, I want to be there to help him. There's no question about that. I think he would do a great job. And New York needs people like Andrew Yang.
What do you think are the biggest problems facing New York as a city right now? What would he have to work on?
Well, there's so many different problems. I'm not necessarily sure I'm going to be able to tier them for you, but I think some of the priorities is just to stabilize the middle class. And some of the priorities is to kind of look through the economic metrics of 2013 in terms of a growing city, rising wages, and see how we can get back to that. I think it's not about left or right policy for the city of New York, but right or wrong policy. You have people leaving the state. It's a very high tax, high cost of living state. And so we have to figure out how to make the state attractive for people to stay and to bring people in. And by the way, what I would say to people is I don't mind paying the costs as long as you're getting what you pay for. I'm always of the point of view that taxation is a price for services. And so therefore, are these services priced right, or is there something wrong with the pricing? And so somebody like Andrew Yang, I think, could come in here and we could figure out a way to more properly and more efficiently deliver services and also deliver whatever it is that we're delivering. He's for direct transfer payments to people. You and I both know that works better. It's cleaner. It's more efficient than going through all of these layers of bureaucracy, where all of a sudden $1's put into the tube and 44 cents is reaching the end user. Where just think about if $1's put into the tube and 98 cents reaches the end user. Well, guess what? Then you have to use less dollars, right? Because you don't have to go through all those machinations. And so Andrew understands all of that. There's a way to make the city more efficient. There's a way to make the city even safer, although it's a very safe city. But we have to deal with the issues of the increases of homeless people in the city. Listen, people are not going to like me for saying this. Left-leaning or radical left-leaning policies don't seem to be working in these urban areas. That's not saying that we have to go right-wing, but we need something in the middle ground. We need something like the way Mike Bloomberg approached the city of New York for the 12-year period that he was running it. The city was probably at its apex when he left. And so radical left doesn't work. You know that from San Francisco. We know that from other cities. We have to figure it out. and we have to do it in a real common sense oriented way. Andrew's got common sense in spades.
Yeah, well, as Andrew used to say about his 2020 campaign, it was not left or right, but forward. So hopefully we'll have to watch him closely. I was looking at some early polling data, and he polls pretty strong in New York across all demographic groups. So it seems like very plausible that he could actually pull it off.
Well, he had a very successful run for president in the following respect. I would say Pete Buttigieg's the same way, is that they raised their national profile, they raised their name recognition, and they raised the idea around them as can-do people and as people that could be forces for good in government. And so that's a reason to be optimistic, Tom. You know, people like Andrew Yang that want to go into government is a reason for optimism.
Anthony, I know we're out of time. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with the audience or tell us about before we wrap up?
Well, listen, no, not really. I mean, I think it's a hopeful and aspirational message for 2021. We're going to get through this. I guess, you know, because I am a nerd, even though I have this Italian exoskeleton. You could look at my resume and the books that I am very much so a nerd. And so I'll say something, I'll end this on a very nerdy, but also optimistic note. And that is one of stay patient. You know, Daniel Goldman wrote in Emotional Intelligence about the famous marshmallow test. And that there were young kids that were offered the choice between a marshmallow immediately, or the person was going to run an errand and they were going to get 2 marshmallows. And the people that were able to delay gratification have done way better in life than the people that were into short-termism or immediate gratification. And so we have the holidays upon us. Of course, we have this urge to see our relatives and our loved ones and party on New Year's Eve and all this other stuff. But my recommendation is wait for the 2 marshmallows. Let's stay patient, and it will release the undue burden on our healthcare workers, and it will help us get to the other side of this thing. And then you'll be able to party hardy, and you'll have more to party with. And so I think that's my message for everybody. It's a very nerdy message, Tom.
No, I love it. And I love the fact that you have been so generous with your time coming on to this show now twice, Mooch. We don't have the biggest audience, but we may have one of the nerdiest ones in terms of our love for details and data and logic and those kinds of things.
I got a lot of time for you, Tom.
I want to echo what you were saying about hopefully everybody watching this will, of course, we're all optimistic and enthusiastic about the vaccinations when they're available and we get 70% of the country vaccinated. Like, things will be very, very different. Until then, please wear masks, stay 6 feet apart, wash your hands, stay with your pod. And as much as you want to for Christmas and New Year's, please avoid traveling, avoid mixing large groups. Hospitals are almost at their breaking point. If you're not worried about yourself, do it for your neighbor. It is Christmas. It's the season of giving. Think about the bigger picture, and hopefully we'll celebrate an amazing 2021 Christmas.
Amen.
Because
I think it's very well said, Tom. All right, well, happy New Year, everybody, and Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy Hanukkah, whatever you're celebrating. I wish you the best.
All right, my friend Mooch, we'll have to have you back again soon.
With time, I got all the time in the world for nerds, my brother.
Well, one last thing, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.